She was 25 years old. She carried a small bag, a sketchbook, and a head full of plans that February morning in 1974. On February 15th, Mary Schleiss climbed into a stranger's car on a frozen Wisconsin highway, and she never made it home. That is not a story about a young woman who made a bad decision. That is a story about a predator who lived the next 50 years pretending to be an ordinary man while a family waited and grieved and never stopped asking what happened to their daughter. And it would take 5 decades, a single stocking hat left behind at a rural intersection, and a team of college genealogists working from a New Jersey campus to finally give them an answer. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to Minneapolis in the winter of 1974. Because to understand what was taken, you first have to understand who Mary Schleiss was. Minneapolis in February of 1974 was the kind of cold that settled into your bones and stayed there. The city ran on strong coffee, hard work, and the particular warmth that Midwestern communities generate when the weather outside refuses to cooperate. In the Whittier neighborhood, a young woman named Mary Schleiss had been building something. Not just a life, but a vision of one. She was 25, a trained artist with a painter's eye and a traveler's restlessness, the kind of person who saw the ordinary world and kept looking for the color underneath it. She had grown up in a family that valued hard work and connection, the kind of house where dinner was eaten together and plans were shared over the table. By 1974, she was pursuing her art seriously, chasing shows, building a portfolio, trying to find the rooms where her work could be seen. Friends who knew her described a woman with a quick laugh and a serious mind, someone who held opinions firmly but listened well, who could talk about painting for hours and then turn around and ask you about your grandmother. In February of that year, there was an art show in Chicago that Mary had been looking forward to. The exhibition was the kind of event that mattered to a young artist trying to make her way. The right rooms, the right eyes, the right conversations. She had arranged to make the trip from Minneapolis to Chicago, a journey that in those days a great many young people still made the way their generation did. Hitchhiking was common then, especially along the interstate corridors of the upper Midwest. Station wagons pulled over, truckers offered rides. People trusted the road in ways that are harder to explain to anyone who came of age after the world changed. Mary Schleiss set out on the morning of February 15, 1974, heading east and south toward Chicago, her sketchbook tucked under her arm and her mind on the show ahead. Somewhere along Highway 12 in western Wisconsin, she accepted a ride. She was alive and warm and thinking about art. That was the last time anyone who loved her knew where she was. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon on February 15, 1974, a passerby traveling along a rural road near the intersection of 408th Avenue and 990th Street in Spring Brook Township, Wisconsin, a quiet stretch of farmland 8 miles west of Eau Claire, noticed something in the roadside snow. They stopped. They looked closer. And then they called the Dunn County Sheriff's Office. Deputies arrived within the hour. What they found was the body of a young woman. She had been stabbed. The scene was cold, the February air cutting across the open fields, and whoever had done this was already gone. Gone before she was even found. In the first hours of the investigation, deputies worked to identify the victim. Records and personal effects eventually led them to Mary Schleiss of Minneapolis. She was 25 years old. She had left that morning to attend an art show in Chicago. She had not made it past Wisconsin. Among the evidence collected at that rural intersection was a stocking hat. It lay near the body, dark against the snow. Investigators bagged it carefully. At the time, they understood it was important. They could not have known yet exactly how important or how long it would take to unlock what it was holding. 3 witnesses in the area reported seeing a vehicle and a male suspect believed to be connected to the crime. Descriptions were collected. The information was filed. But the physical evidence was thin, and in 1974, the forensic science available to investigators was a fraction of what it would become. Hair samples could be compared under a microscope. Fingerprints could be lifted and filed. But the molecular code inside a single strand of hair, the code that would one day identify a killer with near-perfect certainty, was science that had not yet been born. The Dunn County Sheriff's Office opened a homicide investigation. It would be the longest case in the department's history. In the weeks that followed Mary's death, investigators worked with what they had. Detective work in 1974 was a manual process. Shoe leather and phone calls, canvas interviews, paper files stacked in manila folders. The lead detective assigned to the case, working out of the Dunn County Sheriff's Office, pursued the witness statements and traced the reported vehicle. The 3 witnesses who had seen someone near Mary's location that afternoon gave consistent enough descriptions to develop a profile of the suspect. A white male, middle-aged, driving a specific type of vehicle. But profiles without names don't produce arrests. Investigators developed a list of individuals whose descriptions and whereabouts warranted attention. They worked through that list methodically, the kind of grinding work that homicide detectives do without cameras or recognition. The work that fills years before anyone outside the department notices. Several men were looked at closely. Several were interviewed. One by one, they were cleared. Back in Minneapolis, Mary's family was living in the particular hell that families of homicide victims know, the public horror followed by silence, the investigation that goes on but produces no answers anyone can share with you. Her mother kept the newspaper clippings. Her father carried the weight of unanswered questions into every room he entered. Friends called in the first weeks, then called less. The world moved on, the way the world does. Investigators would later confirm that every lead pursued in those first years eventually reached a wall. The stocking hat was catalogued and preserved. The witness statements were on file, but without a name, without a single piece of evidence that could be matched to a specific individual, the investigation had nowhere to go. By the end of the 1970s, the Mary Schleiss case had gone cold. By 1984, 10 years had passed since Mary was killed on that frozen Wisconsin roadside. Her family had marked each anniversary in their own way, not with ceremony, but with the specific, private grief of people who had learned to carry something heavy without putting it down. Her mother still had the sketchbook Mary had left behind, the one she hadn't taken on that last trip. She still looked at the drawings sometimes. The house next door in Minneapolis had changed hands twice. The neighborhood had changed. The interstate where hitchhikers once caught rides had become less friendly, the practice less common, the world having absorbed the lesson of cases like Mary's without ever knowing her name. The detective who had worked her case retired in the mid-1980s. Before he left the department, he made sure the physical evidence was properly stored. He didn't say it out loud, but he understood that the stocking hat, bagged and preserved in the Dunn County evidence room, was now the case's best hope. He just didn't know how or when that hope would be cashed. By 1994, 20 years had gone by. DNA technology had entered forensic science, and law enforcement agencies around the country were beginning to understand what it could do. The Dunn County Sheriff's Office sent the stocking hat for analysis. Technicians were able to pull a partial male DNA profile from the hat. The science had advanced enough to identify a genetic signature, But identifying a profile and matching it to a person are two different things, and without a name to match it against, the partial profile sat in a file, promising but silent. Then 2004 came. 30 years. The world had changed in ways that would have been unrecognizable to the people who stood at that rural intersection in February 1974. The internet had arrived, cell phones were everywhere, and the science of DNA was moving faster than any single law enforcement agency could fully track. The Dunn County Sheriff's Office kept the case alive. New detectives inherited the file. New technology was applied periodically. Each time, investigators got a little closer, but still not close enough. Every case on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that were lost. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, please take a second to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now, let's get back to Mary Schleiss. The case had been cold for nearly half a century when the breakthrough finally arrived. And it came from a direction almost no one had anticipated. It was sometime in the early 2020s when Dunn County Sergeant Jason Stalker and the investigation team made a decision that would change everything. The partial DNA profile extracted from the stocking hat, the same hat that had been collected from that rural intersection 50 years earlier, was submitted to a team of investigative genetic genealogists at Ramapo College in New Jersey. Genetic genealogy is a process that most people understand intuitively, even if they don't know the formal name for it. The technique works by uploading crime scene DNA to public ancestry databases, the same websites where ordinary people look up their family history, and tracing distant relatives backward through family trees until investigators can narrow in on a single unknown contributor. It is painstaking work. It requires eliminating dozens of possible relatives before a picture begins to emerge. Karen Binder, a genealogy investigator at Ramapo, later described the process in Mary's case as one of the most complicated family tree investigations her team had encountered. It took over a year. The family lineage connected to the partial DNA profile was wide, and investigators had to work through it branch by branch, relative by relative. Then something unusual happened. As the team eliminated known family members, one by one, they reached a point in the tree where someone was missing. There had been an adoption. Somewhere in the family line, a child had been placed and records had not followed. Sergeant Stalker received the update at the Dunn County Sheriff's Office. The family tree had led them to a branch with a gap, and that gap pointed toward a man who had not appeared in any of the original investigation's records. A man who had lived a long, ordinary-seeming life far from Springbrook Township. A man who was now 84 years old and living in Owatonna, Minnesota. His name was John Keith Miller. Investigators moved carefully. In cases built on genetic genealogy, the DNA evidence must be confirmed through direct biological collection. A cup, a discarded item, something a suspect has touched and left behind in a public place. The science of the Ramapo team had pointed to Miller. What investigators needed now was confirmation. That confirmation came. Biological relatives of Miller cooperated with investigators, a fact that the Dunn County Sheriff's Office later acknowledged publicly, noting the role that family cooperation had played in closing the case. The DNA match was solid. The evidence was assembled. And investigators moved to confront the man who had spent 50 years living freely while Mary Schleiss's family waited. When confronted with the DNA evidence, court documents confirmed that John Keith Miller admitted to picking up Mary Schleiss while she was hitchhiking on that February day in 1974. He admitted to stabbing her. He admitted to leaving her at that rural Wisconsin intersection while she was still dying. 50 years. He had kept that secret for 50 years. On November 7, 2024, John Keith Miller, 84 years old, a grandfather by now, a man his community in Owatonna, Minnesota, would not have looked at twice on any ordinary day, was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The Dunn County Sheriff's Office issued a statement. Sheriff Kevin Beigd stood at a press conference the following Friday and described Mary Schleiss the way the people who knew her would have wanted her described, as a bright young woman with a bright future, whose life had been taken from her far too early. The arrest, he said, was a huge victory for the department and for the family that had waited 5 decades to hear that justice was finally moving. The community reaction was not what it once might have been. John Miller had not been a known figure in Dunn County. He had lived his life in Minnesota, hidden not by fame or trust, but by the simple fact of distance and time. What shocked people was not that a neighbor had done this. It was that an ordinary-seeming man had carried this secret into his 80s, had lived an entire second life, had perhaps sat at dinner tables and smiled in family photographs, while Mary Schleiss's mother held a sketchbook and asked questions no one could answer. The arrest shocks community when the community learns the truth, and the truth here was 50 years of impunity, finally ending at the edge of old age. There is a sketchbook somewhere that Mary Schleiss did not take with her on February 15, 1974. She left it behind because she was traveling light, heading to an art show, expecting to come home. The drawings inside it are hers, her eye, her hand, her particular way of seeing the world that no one else had, and no one else will ever replicate. That is what was lost at that rural Wisconsin intersection. Not just a life, but a vision, a future full of work that would never be made. Mary's family, who spent 50 years living with a question that had no answer, learned in November 2024 that the man responsible had finally been named. Sheriff Beigd spoke about them at the press conference with the care of someone who understood exactly what that moment meant. 50 years is not a number. It is a measurement of all the anniversaries endured, all the holidays that carried weight they shouldn't have, all the times someone who loved Mary had to explain, again, that no, it was never solved. No, they still didn't know. Now they know. The legacy of Mary's case goes beyond one family's grief. The Dunn County Sheriff's Office preserved evidence for 50 years. The stocking hat, the case file, the partial DNA profile, on the faith that science would eventually catch up to what they needed. That faith was not naive. It was disciplined, sustained across multiple administrations and generations of investigators, and ultimately rewarded. The partnership with Ramapo College represents a model that is increasingly common in cold case work. Academic institutions contributing expertise that small county departments cannot maintain on their own. Cases that would have remained permanently cold are being opened again, one partial DNA profile at a time. John Keith Miller was 84 years old when he was arrested. He had been 24 years old when he killed Mary Schleiss. The intervening decades did not erase what he did, and the genetic code preserved in a single stocking hat collected from a frozen Wisconsin roadside in February 1974 made sure they never could. There is something worth sitting with in that fact. Evidence doesn't age the way memory does. A strand of hair, properly preserved, carries its information forward across decades with perfect fidelity, waiting patiently for the moment when someone has the tools to read it. The killer moved on. The world moved on. But that hat sat in an evidence room in Dunn County and held its secret until the time was right to give it up. Justice came for Mary Schleiss after 50 years, Stories like hers remind us that truth, however late, always finds its way to the light. Before you go, a few questions worth thinking about. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe that justice served after 50 years is still justice? Or does the passage of time change what it means? What struck you most about how this case was finally solved? And how many other cold cases do you think are sitting right now in evidence rooms across the country, waiting for the same technology that finally gave Mary's family an answer? If you believe that truth deserves to be told no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. And if you want more solved cold cases, the links are waiting in the description. Thank you for watching.